Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and I like to read science fiction from a range of eras, and recently I've done a pretty good job of that, with books from 1949 all the way up to 2018. So let's take a journey through science fiction history and see which ones I recommend, starting with What Mad Universe by Frederick Brown. So I bought this book because I read Brown's short story Arena, and I thought that was fantastic. So I've been meaning to get to What Mad Universe for a while, and I was happy to see it picked as the patron pick of the month for February. The premise for the book is that a science fiction editor finds himself in a parallel universe, and he has to find out how he got there and if he's able to return home. The book reads like pulp sci-fi, but also has some qualities of a parody, as it pokes fun at some of the tropes of pulp science fiction. It's not overly comedic, but I did find the writing to be amusing at times, and generally just rather pleasant to read. The first act has a great setup, and I was hooked by the mystery. The second act slows down a little, and the universe wasn't quite as mad as I hoped a book titled What Mad Universe would be. I think as a fan of Philip K. Dick, I only found it mildly mad in comparison. However, things do pick back up again in the third act with some great reveals and conclusions. I thought the character writing was a little shallow, and some of the female characters feel like they are written for the male gaze. For example, there is a woman who is perpetually in a bikini. However, the book does provide a reason for this, specifically in order to call out this kind of writing. So, in some ways, I do actually think this book has aged better than some other classic sci-fi. Overall, I found this to be a fun, fast read with some clever science fiction concepts. I did have a few minor issues, but they never fully took me out of the reading experience. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Moving on, we have The Invincible by Stanislav Lem. This was the third book I've read from Lem, and I absolutely loved Solaris and the Futurological Congress. Solaris was philosophical and atmospheric, whereas the Futurological Congress was a little bit more surreal and had a bit of an amusing tone, so I was looking forward to seeing what The Invincible was like. In the book, we follow the crew of a spaceship as they search a planet for a sister ship that has gone missing, and they encounter some alien oddities on their mission. Now, this is by far the hardest science fiction book of the three I've read from Lem, which I thought I was going to like because I do enjoy hard sci-fi, but for the most part, the sciencey info dumps didn't really work for me. In Solaris, there were some short info dumps, but I thought they mostly worked because they were adding information to a world that I was immersed in. In The Invincible, I felt like the story dragged a little bit, and therefore those info dumps only served to slow the story down even more. Lem is an author that focuses more on big ideas than character development, and thin characters isn't something that really bothers me or hinders my reading enjoyment, and I think the characters in his other books had just enough of an interesting perspective for me to be able to connect to them through their experiences. Whereas in The Invincible, the characters were just so flat, I even had trouble remembering who was who or what their names were, and I think that lessened the book's impact. Fortunately, the book still held my interest with its alien world and what I found to be a strong ending. It didn't quite reach my expectations set by the previous two books, and I do think it explored some familiar ground, but I think there's enough interesting sci-fi ideas here for it to still be a worthwhile read. I gave it a 7.5 out of 10. And as we keep traveling along, we reach Where Late the Sweet Bird Sang by Kate Wilhelm. So this book was a patron pick for the month of March and a Hugo Award winner for the year 1977. I have now read 37 of the Hugo Award winners for Best Novel, so I was looking forward to seeing where this ranked among them for me. The story starts during an apocalypse where the planet is ravaged by environmental disasters and global diseases. As human fertility starts to go down, a small community of survivors starts to experiment with cloning in order to preserve humanity. Now, I quite like the opening of the book as I enjoyed the world building as well as Wilhelm's prose. My only minor criticism was that it moved so quickly, it felt like we were just getting an overview of the events, and that made it harder for me to connect to the characters. The story then skips forward in time, and I started to find it a little harder to follow, and the logic of some of the scientific processes weren't entirely clear to me. I would have preferred a few more explanations. Even if Wilhelm was just making up the science, I think that would have helped answer some lingering questions. By the time I got to the end, the book had lost my interest, as I didn't feel connected to the story or the characters. There were some interesting themes, but they didn't feel entirely fleshed out or reach any satisfying conclusions. One argument in favor of the book is that it did lead to some great discussions on our Discord server. So I think there are some interesting concepts here that are worth intellectually grappling with, even if the consensus of those discussions was that the book didn't quite stick the landing with those concepts. Overall, I think this book had potential, but just didn't fully come together for me. I gave it a 6.5 out of 10. And that brings us to Forbidden Knowledge by Stephen R. Donaldson. So this book and the next one are books 2 and 3 in the Gap Cycle. This is a 5-book series which is a grimdark space opera loosely inspired by Wagner's Ring Cycle operas. To me, the first book, The Real Story, almost felt like a prequel, as it mainly focuses on the relationships between the main 3 characters. So I was looking forward to the story taking off in Book 2. And Book 2 certainly did feel bigger and more like a space opera. There's some interesting technology here, and I felt the scale of the universe a lot more in Book 2. However, it's still character-focused as it explores the relationships of characters on a spaceship. And this was a mixed bag for me. I felt like the supporting characters lacked clear motivations, and I didn't understand some of their decisions that they made towards the end of the book. I liked the main characters a bit more, but I did still have a few small gripes. One of the characters is presented as incredibly clever and somebody that just never loses. However, the character didn't fully read like this to me. I would have preferred some more examples of being shown this cleverness rather than just being told about it. There was also one character that I thought had quite strong plot armor. If I was the quote-unquote bad guy on this spaceship, I would have put them in an airlock and blasted them out into space at least 6 times based on how much of a nuisance they were. However, I do understand why this character maybe needed or even deserved some of this plot armor. Also, something to note is that in my review of the first book, I mentioned that there are graphic depictions of abuse. Compared to the science fiction that I have read, I would say it's about a 9 out of 10 in terms of the level of graphic content. For books 2 and 3, I would put this at about a 7 out of 10. So it's still grimdark content and might not be suitable for everyone, but it's at least a little bit easier to read than the first book. Getting back to the story, I thought that book 2 felt a little bit bloated when compared to the first, but it never completely lost my interest because of the strength of the writing. I've been buddy reading this series with Josh from Red Fury Books, and I remember screenshotting a passage and sending it to him because of how well written I thought that passage was. Overall, I enjoyed some of the writing and the themes, but the story and characters fell just a little bit flat. I ended up giving it a 7.5 out of 10. And that brings us to Book 3, A Dark and Hungry God Arises. Now, a big difference between the first 2 books and this third book is that there are way more POVs in A Dark and Hungry God Arises. At first, I was intrigued by these new perspectives, but ultimately, I don't think they worked for me. Most of the new character perspectives weren't that interesting, and with so many characters to follow, it really slowed down the plot progression. This book reminded me a little bit of Babylon's Ashes from The Expanse. That series mostly had about 4 POVs per book, until it got to book 6, where we then had about 20 POVs, and I felt like it really just messed with the flow and the pacing. The first book in the Gap Cycle was about 220 pages, and was a fairly quick, albeit tough read. The second book was around 450 pages and was a little bit slower, and the third book was about 520 pages and was even slower than that. This isn't a great trend considering the last 2 books in the series are about 700 pages each. And my main issue with the book was that there were just so many conversations repeating information from earlier in the book, or even from the previous book. There was a potentially interesting power struggles and some politicking, but the scheming revolved mostly around lying to people, and the payoff for each of these lies was just another chapter of exposition later in the book. However, after around 400 pages of disappointment, the last 100 pages were really, really good. It was tense and exciting and cinematic and everything you want out of a space opera. And that's why I'm kind of frustrated with this series, because Donaldson is a talented writer. There are some interesting ideas here, but they are just increasingly buried under long-winded dialogue. This one was tough to rate, but I ended up giving A Dark and Hungry God Arises a 7 out of 10. It's a good book, and it's a good series, but I'm starting to feel like each book is less and less worth the squeeze. There's only 2 books left for me to read, but those 2 books are longer than the first 3 combined, and I'm feeling less motivated to continue the series than I am other books that I want to read. I might come back to it in the future, but for the moment, I'm putting a pause on the gap cycle. And finally, we arrive at an almost modern-day destination with Elysium Fire by Alistair Reynolds. Here we have a continuation of another series with Book 2 in the Prefect Dreyfuss trilogy, a prequel sub-series within the Revelation Space universe. I absolutely loved the first book, The Prefect, which was later retitled Aurora Rising, so the bar was set very high for Elysium Fire. The series combines detective sci-fi with space opera, and the case for this book is that a group of seemingly unrelated people start dying from malfunctions of their neural implants. And the rate at which these people are dying is on the rise, so there's a race to solve the mystery of who is causing these malfunctions and why. The Revelation Space universe is just a really fun world to explore, with its various habitats that are part of the Glitter Band, with its creative array of technology and political systems. And Reynolds does a great job of making a detective mystery feel like it has massive implications. I don't think character writing is Reynolds' primary strength, but I do like these characters and enjoy spending time with them. I think he does a good job of writing flawed characters that you can still root for. Throughout the book, I felt like the plot and sci-fi concepts were just a notch below the first book, Aurora Rising. But then, I absolutely loved the ending of Elysium Fire. One of the storylines we follow feels pretty separate from the rest of the book, but when Reynolds finally connects them, it comes together in just such a clever and satisfying way. I ended up giving Elysium Fire a 9 out of 10. I have it just under Aurora Rising, but I still thought it was awesome, and I can't wait to read the third book, Machine Vendetta. So we had a pretty good mix of books there, with Elysium Fire being my favorite. I hope one or more of those books sounded interesting to you, and if not, I'll give you one more option as we spin the quantum wheel in order to find out the patron pick of the month for April. Welcome to the quantum wheel, where all of the patron picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of April. Will it be as good as Where Late the Swede Sang? What Mad Universe? Or maybe even Elysium Fire? That would be a good month. It looks like it might be Kindred! Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Okay, so I'm a fan of Butler. I've read a few of her books. I quite like Parable of the Sower, and I really liked Dawn, the first book in the Xenogenesis series. So Kindred, time travel story. I've heard this one is a bit of a tough read though, so you might have to be in the mood for it. But if it sounds interesting to you, join us in the month of April and read Kindred. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash, or just gently click, the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, New Eden, Half-Ogre, Zakawe, Samil, Colin, and the Ageless Bamsis. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.